Hi-ho and welcome to Down Under the Radar. I'm Lance Schooler, the Savvy Navigator, and in this 2-hour special edition of Down Under the Radar, I'm talking to communication specialist Jeff Stone. The topic Jeff and I are discussing is the characteristics of successful people. Jeff has worked in both television and radio in the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and Australia. As an Australian broadcaster, Jeff is probably best known as host of long-running television series The Inventors and What'll They Think Of Next. Jeff has met many successful people over his extensive career in business, television and radio. In this 2-hour interview, Jeff discusses the characteristics of success he has discovered in many of the people he has worked with and interviewed. In part 1 of this 2-part edition, we discuss his own accidental entry into broadcasting and talk about the success principles he discovered for himself. We also look at important lessons he learned and observed from well-known people like Australian entrepreneur Dick Smith and British wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In part 2, we look at the way we come up with our own belief systems and what impact our belief systems have on our own path to success. So join me now in this fascinating discussion with Jeff Stone. I know you're going to enjoy it.
One of the greatest things that happened to me in my life was the fact that I became a broadcaster purely by accident. I mean, I had no intention, never ever thought that I'd become one, but I ended up in a broadcasting job, and I met so many successful people over the years that I've decided to learn from all these successful people and apply it both to my life and other people's as well. But even getting the job was, in fact, one of the very first lessons in success that I came across. I was at a show business party one day in London, and some little girl came up to me. Remember, I was a salesman, and she came up to me and she said,
So what were you selling, Jeff?
I was selling bicycles for Raleigh Industries, rally bikes.
Oh, right.
I still reckon they're the best in the business, by the way.
They're still around, are they?
Yeah, they're still around, except most of them come from Taiwan or somewhere now, but anyway. And anyhow, she said to me, "Oh, you make a wonderful BBC television announcer." Now, being a salesman, I said, "You're right. Who do I write to?" You see? And somebody else said, his name's Rex Morfoot. He's up at the BBC, head of not entertainment. He was the head of, it doesn't matter. Head of production, I think he was. Anyway, I wrote, "Dear Mr. Morfoot, my name's Jeffrey Stone. I make a very good BBC television announcer. P.S. You need me." Signed it. See, there it was. And forgot all about it. We'd all had a few beers. And 2 weeks later, I got a letter back from the BBC, and it said, "Dear Mr. Stone, thank you for your letter. We don't." That's all it said. And I thought, hang on, what was all that to do with? It came back mistily. But anyhow, what I didn't realise, that puts you on the list. And 6 months down the track, I had this other letter, Roneo thing, saying, "We're holding auditions for announcers at the BBC. And if you want to make a 30-second announcement and you want to come up and audition, go for your life." Now, this is where the story really begins, because I thought to myself, I've never been in a television studio. That'd be a great thing to experience, you see. So I decided I'd go, and I picked up a copy of the Radio Times, as it was called in the UK, and there were some big sports headlines. I thought, well, I can see those without too much trouble. And I wandered in. I didn't have a nerve in my body. I had no idea this would ever lead to anything. And I sat in...
Was that part of the clue? Because
Yeah.
you weren't
Yes,
after the job.
it was part of the clue.
Just an experience you just
Yes.
thought, that's all.
And I found it repeating itself later on. Because I'll tell you one or two things about that, because it's the way we think that has such an enormous power over it. Anyway, so I breeze on in there. There's 5 other blokes. They've got scripts and they're swatting it up. And I'm thinking, what's with them? I was just going to sit down and chat for 30 seconds. Anyway, so the door opens, the little girl comes in, and they all looked at me. And I said, "No, I'll go first. That's all right." So I wandered in, sat down. It was dark and there was a big light that shone at me. and a disembodied voice that said, "Stand by, in 10 seconds, 9, 8, ever British, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I did my 30 seconds, and they said, "Thank you, we'll be in touch." And I left. Forgot all about it.
Anything.
No, not a thing. Next morning I get a phone call from the BBC saying, "We thought that was really rather good. Would you like a week's work for £25? In the days when everybody else was only £5. And I thought, oh, I can fit that in. That's no problem. So
you're still selling bicycles?
I'm still selling bicycles. So anyway, I'd go in from 4:30 p.m. till midnight.
Oh, okay.
You see? And I got paid £25 a week for just saying, "This is BBC Television." Anyway, that's all I had to do.
You're kidding?
Yeah, no, when the red light came on, that's all I had to do. You didn't see me, you just heard me. So anyhow, that was the start. And then about 3 months down the track, all the fellas got the sack and girls were put in our place. And by now I'd got the bug. I wanted to be in broadcasting. And I said to one or two other fellas, and here comes the second lesson, I said, "Does anybody know of an agent? Because I think I probably need one in order to get myself going." And this chap
So
said,
why did you think that?
"Well, because I knew that I knew enough to use words, but you need more contact information than that, don't you? You need somebody who knows the business of broadcasting.
It's not what you know.
I mean, it's a bit like what you do, isn't it? You've got to know what you're about, and I didn't. I was completely green. So he said, "Well, the only thing I can think," he said, "there's a firm called MCA. It's called Music Corporation of America." And I thought, "Oh, they'll do. They're just down the road in Bond Street." So I rang this bloke up. And what I didn't know, thank God I didn't, but this is lesson number 2, I didn't realise that they didn't deal with people like Jeff Stone, the non-entities of television. They only dealt with big television and film stars, both American, British, German, you name it, they were universal. And the guy on the other end of the phone was so amused that this total non-entity should say, "Look, I'm looking for an agent. I thought you might be..." I thought you might go for it. Anyway, he invited me in, and it sat there. I still remember. He was a good friend of mine now. And he sat behind his desk with a big cigar, typical agent. And he said, "Well, so what makes you think you're so good?" And I said, "Well, I managed to get this far, but I need help." And he said, "All right, let's just see how good you are." And he picked up the phone, rang Granada Television in Chelsea down the road. It didn't occur to me that there was anything special about that. I thought that's what agents did. And he said, "I've just fixed you up. You're going to do an audition for Granada. And when you've finished, come back and see me." So I toddled down to Granada and came back again. And when I walked into his office, he was laid back in the chair smiling. And I said, "Well, how'd it go?" He said, "Well, they just offered you a 7-year contract at £50 a week." I said, "Harry, that is fantastic." He said, "Oh, I've turned it down." "You what?" Truly, he turned it down. And I said, "Why would you do that?" He said, "Well, if they're prepared to take you on sight unseen at £50 a week, I reckon I can do better than that." And he did. But the lesson was simply this. If I'd known that MCA was a huge organisation that didn't touch little people like me, I'd never have asked, would I? And that was one right at the very beginning, when I wrote to Rex Morford. It never occurred to me anything would happen. But one thing came out of it. After that, I began to make progress in the world of television. But I found another interesting thing was happening to me. The programmes I really wanted to work on, I never got. The ones I didn't want, I always got. And eventually, sometime I thought, I wonder why this is happening. And you've probably guessed it.
You're trying too hard.
Yeah, trying too hard. Yeah. My body language probably wasn't right. And I spoke, "Please, sir, for God's sake, give me the job." And it doesn't work. You have to approach things, and I've discovered now, you care, but not too much.
I've heard...
Not too much.
Heard Carl?
Yeah.
The writes books on negotiation.
That's right, he does. You can negotiate anything.
And that's what he said.
That's
He's
right.
hopeless at negotiating for his own family.
Yeah. Yes.
Going to buy a car for the family is hopeless because he's involved.
That's absolutely right.
That's the saying he uses.
Yeah, that's absolutely
but
right.
not too much.
Yes, that's true. So I learnt some real basic stuff just out of going into broadcasting. But one other lesson I learned, and again it's a story, I eventually ended up working for BBC Radio and BBC Television, and one winter's day, bitterly cold and everybody had the flu, I was in there. I'd been in news for about 3 weeks. That's how green I was. And I'd already pre-recorded my bit for the 6 o'clock, what was it, the BBC National Programme. It doesn't exist anymore. But it was the big news programme of the day. And my boss came in, he said, Jeff, do you think you could produce the news? Now, I'd never produced anything in my life. And I thought, well, I can't say no, can I? You know how you get pressured sometimes? I said, yes, I suppose I can. He said, right, well, remember, it's 4 o'clock now, we need the news up and running at 6. And I thought, oh. And then I thought, what have I done? Because I had no idea. But I learned another quick lesson I learned was that is, first of all, always say yes and then figure out how to do it afterwards. That came later though. And the other thing I discovered was if you don't know the answer to a question, go find somebody who does. And that's what I did. And I found an older fellow who had produced the news. I said, tell me what to do for God's sake. And he did. And so the news went off fine that day, and nobody complained, nothing like that went wrong. And that was another kind of message to me. And that was, don't say no. If you think you can do it, even if you're not sure, give it a go. And I discovered after that I became a documentary writer. I did motoring programs, yachting programs, just by saying yes, and then figuring out how to do it afterwards.
Did you still have situations where there's something you wanted,
yes,
and you still couldn't get them?
Yes, but they were getting fewer.
Because your mindset...
Yes, that's right, because the mindset had changed. Yeah. I was also getting better known, and I think all those things played a big part. But I think I should also go back a bit as well, because when I came out of the Air Force, I'd been working in the Berlin Airlift doing air traffic control work, talking to the aeroplanes.
Oh, okay. You've done a lot, haven't you?
Well, I have sort of, I suppose. Yeah, but I wasn't supposed to talk to aeroplanes. I was supposed to know how to do it, but I wasn't supposed to do it. Officers did that, not Irks like me. Right. Anyway, I mean, what I didn't know, again, what you don't know, it so happened that all the people who were working during the Berlin Airlift were ex-World War II bomber fighter pilots, you name it, and they grounded and they're now doing air traffic control work. And they didn't give a stuff. I mean, they'd been through a war, they didn't want to work. And so within about a week of working in the tower, my boss said to me one Sunday, which was relatively quiet, he said, well, you can look after the tower today, I'm going down to the pub. And I thought, oh, terrific, So, but you get thrown in the deep end, don't you? Yeah. And I knew the theory, and then I had to put it into practice. And again, it's the old thing. You may not think you can do it, but when the crunch comes, you'd be surprised where you get the information to do it. So I did that as well. So again, all these things are sort of tying in together. They only came to me properly later on. But going back even after I came out of the RAF, my mother got fed up with me sitting at home doing nothing, and she said, well, go and join a club or something. Well, there weren't any clubs around our place except the Young Conservatives Club at the top of the hill. So I let her do. So I wandered up there and I went in, and it was, I didn't realise it, but it was public speaking night. And I hadn't done any public speaking up till then except talking to aeroplanes. And because I was the new boy, they said, right, well, you can do the first speech for 60 seconds, starting now. Your subject is nothing. Talk about nothing for 60 seconds. Of course, if I'd thought about it, I should have shut up for 60 seconds. That would have been talking about nothing. But I didn't, and I don't know what I said. But I ended up, after about a year or so, as the chairman of the Young Conservative Club. And then I went on to the National Committee. And that led me to a man called Winston Churchill. And I used to go and have a monthly meeting with him, and all the other reps, of course, from the rest of England, Scotland and Wales. And I learnt a lot from the old man.
So this is after the war?
Yes, it is about 1950 odd, something like that, when I'm 3. No, but anyway, I'm a young man. He was very old, I was very young. One day I had the opportunity of having a chat with him, because I'd been in England right through the war. I'd been bombed and machine gunned and rocketed and doodle-bugged. Nearly got blown up 3 times during the war. And he was my idol. I mean, he was the bloke who won the war for us. I said to him one day, when you became Prime Minister in 1940, no money, Britain was broke already. If it hadn't been for 60 million quid that came out of Norway, we wouldn't have had a penny. We'd lost all of our troops and ammunition and trucks and tanks in Dunkirk. we hadn't got much of an air force, certainly nothing like the German one, and we couldn't use big ships in the English Channel because the German shore guns would just blast them out of the water. I said, what went through your mind? And he said, I never thought in terms of defeat. That was absolutely of no value to me. I only thought in terms of ultimate victory. And I thought, how fascinating, because everybody else in Britain at the time was thinking, why don't we give in? But he didn't. And he was just sufficiently dogmatic, or bloody-minded, I don't know which. But he just wasn't prepared to give in. And he once made a speech to his own boys at Eton. He went back again after the war and made a speech, and he stood up, everybody cheered because the great man was there. And all he said was, boys, I have one message. Never give in, never give in, never give in. And he sat down. That was it.
Long speech.
Long speech, but the point was there, wasn't it? And I'd sort of discovered that one too. And I thought, you may change direction, you may do other things, but never, ever give it up. Because so many of us get 95% of the way towards success, and the last 5% we think it's all too hard, so we give it up. And so that's really where it all began. And from there on in, after that, I met lots of people who were, for example, I met lots of people who were rotten stinking rich. John Paul Getty, lots of film stars in the US of A. One bloke who became a friend of mine, actually, he was a co-inventor of Corningware.
Okay.
They were all rotten, stinking rich, and I didn't meet one happy one. Not one. And I thought, well, being poor isn't so bad either. I wasn't exactly broke by this time. But on the other hand, I didn't make money the key issue of my life, because that's what these people have done. Paul Getty was so sad. I mean, he was in a dark, dingy Victorian house, huge, and he was always wearing dark suits and dark ties, and he was always looking down. He always seemed to be worried about the stock exchange and so on. And I thought, this is no life.
Yes.
It really isn't. And so I decided that life wasn't for me. And I'm glad I did take that attitude, because it wouldn't have got me to Australia in the end.
So you spent some time in the USA?
Yes, I did. I used to go over there mostly because we did a lot of programming we used to buy stuff from CBS, NBC, ABC and so on. And again, another little story that is, I love my stories because there's always a message there.
Yeah.
This Corningware bloke I'd been to see when I flew into Los Angeles, and he invited me round for dinner, and I went round to this small mansion he got in Pasadena, and we had dinner finally at 1 a.m. He was just drinking gin and tonics until 1 a.m. and we were talking. And I finally said, look, I'm sorry, but I've got to go. I mean, I've got a hotel back down the road there, and I must get me a cab. He said, don't take a cab. He said, have one of the cars. And I said, no, I don't want one of your blooming motor cars. Anyway, he led me downstairs, and there they were, 2 Rolls Royces, 1 Lincoln Continental, and a station wagon. He said, oh, by the way, you can't have the station wagon, that belongs to the kids. So that left me the choice of 2 Rolls Royces or a Lincoln. And I thought, well, I don't think I should be too over the top, so I'll just take the Lincoln, which it was expensive, but not as expensive as the others.
Sure.
I didn't realise what had happened, but what had actually happened was that suddenly, when I drove up to the gates of a film studio, they saluted me and opened the gates. And I thought, they don't know who the hell I am. They knew the car, though. And, that's what it did. And I found that through my broadcasting life, it's not good enough just to be good at what you do. You've got to appear to be good enough at what you do. And at one stage, I even bought a second-hand Bentley in England. Best thing I ever did. Because I could park it anywhere illegally, and I had policemen diverting traffic round it, for example, that sort of thing. You wouldn't get away with it today, but back in those days, if you had a Rolls or a Bentley, you were important. You see, I wasn't important, but on the other hand, they didn't know that. They just saw the car.
So importance came to you.
Yes, it did. Yeah, very much. It just happened. And of course, you have to learn to live with that, because after a while, you also become well known, and that's when it could go to your head if you're not careful, and you find that too many people believe their own image, and that's not right either, because they usually come crashing down in a great big lump. I've been broadcasting now for 45 years, I suppose, and I still have an attitude that says I'm very grateful for the opportunity to go and do this and meet the people I've met. So basically, that's where my thinking started about trying today, as I do, to help other people create the same sorts of thinking process. Because if you think about it, all the things that happened to me and all the things that I did because I didn't know they couldn't be done. You think about that. I didn't realise they couldn't be done.
Comes back to that mindset.
Yeah, if I did know they couldn't be done, I wouldn't have done it. Isn't that interesting? But I didn't know. I reckon that's one of the best lessons I ever learned. In other words, if you can't do something, it's because you say you can't do something. It's not because you can't do it. It's because you decide you can't do it. Oh no, I couldn't possibly. How many times do you hear that? Oh, I couldn't possibly learn that new program on the computer. No, there's far too much. The answer is you've just said it's too difficult, so it is. In other words, whatever you think is what you're going to get. And if you decide to think like that in life, that you can't do this and you can't do that, then you won't do it. There's no way in the world you'll do it, will you?
What's that saying? If you think you can, you can.
That's
if you
right.
think you can't,
yeah.
you can't. Both are right.
Well, yes, it is spot on right. And so I think because of those early days, I took the view that you might just as well say yes and get stuck in and figure it out, as opposed to saying, no, I don't think I can do it. And I ran into that on more than one occasion. On one particular occasion, it reminded me of myself. I was learning to fly little aeroplanes here in Australia. And I'd had a terrible morning. The instructor was sitting next to me. We'd done things called circuits and bumps. Bang the plane on the ground, take off again, do a circuit, bang the plane on the ground. And that's what I was doing, banging the plane on the ground. And every time I did this, it would bounce. And well, I kept saying to my instructor, what the hell am I doing wrong this morning? He said, oh, you figure it out. I said, that's what you're sitting here for. You're supposed to tell me. He said, no. He said, I'm not telling you. And after I'd done about 4 bad landings, he said, pull over on the grass. And I pulled over on the grass, and I thought, I'm for it now. And I thought I was going to get a lecture. And instead of which, he got out of the plane. I thought, well, I may be bad, but I didn't think I was. Anyway, so I said, where are you going? He said, well, you're going solo. And he slammed the door. And I sat there for 2 or 3 minutes thinking, he's got to be joking. I mean, I can't even put this thing on the ground properly, let alone go solo. And then, something else happens. And I realised that if I didn't try it, he would be saying, well, what's the matter with you? Yeah. You see? So I thought, I'll do it in little bite-sized pieces. So I taxied as far as the runway beginning. And I sat there for a moment or two. It wasn't a busy day, thank God. and then I thought, well, if I'm going to do it, I better do it. So I picked up the microphone and I said, Charlie uniform, Charlie, ready for takeoff. I'm committed, because they said, you're clear for takeoff. And so I thought, oh, I've got to go now. So I turned the plane around, opened the throttle and took off. And the minute I was airborne, I was busy. I was doing, yeah, my mind went away from all this thing about I can't do it. I just was too busy. And so I got to 500 feet, did a left turn, and then flew at 1,000 feet down the runway. And you've got about 20 seconds to have a think about it while you're doing that, because you're not doing anything else. And I looked at the passenger seat and there was nobody there. And I thought, blimey, I've got to get this thing back on the ground again. Again, as soon as I knew where I had to make the first turn, I was busy again. And you know what? That was the best landing I have ever made, either before or since. I just greased it on the ground. And in other words, left to my own devices again, I wouldn't have done it, would I? If I could make the choice for myself that day, I would have said, oh no, you're not ready. But somebody else decided I was ready. And so again, it proves the point. It's up to you entirely whether or not you're going to do something with your life or not.
Interesting to say that. Did you take it from your instructor? Did you take comfort from the fact that he...
Yes, I did. Because I certainly wasn't feeling very comfortable about it at all. And I think we all do that at some stage or another, but it's a pity that we don't believe people sometimes when we say to somebody else, look, you really can do this. As you know, I run lots of workshops and classes and so on, and I've been teaching people not only what we've just been talking about, but how to go about doing it if they've never done it before. And I think that it is something you can learn. You You don't have to be. I was a very shy kid when I was a youngster. You'd never think it now, would you, really? But I really was incredibly, painfully shy. And I got it knocked out of me. I had no choice. And I think that once you've been through the middle, it's like a big learning curve, isn't it, really? You can either go on with the learning curve and go through the tough bits there and come out the other end and say, hey, I've done that. Or you can give it away. I mean, one example of that is very few people will remember the name of Roger Bannister. But he, in 1954, ran the 1 minute mile for the first time ever in less than 4 minutes. Until that moment, he did it. Everybody said, well, he'll never run faster than a mile in 4 minutes. It just can't be done. Well, he decided that he could do it, and he did it. And the interesting thing is that once he'd done it, 3 or 4 other people did it within a few weeks. So it's, again, we put mental blocks on ourselves. And it really is a shame that we do it. So most of what I do these days is really aimed at helping people remove their mental blocks.
That just brings me to the thought that I first saw you myself as a young person. I guess it was in the mid-70s on TV with The Inventors. But I guess what impressed me was you made people feel at ease, and in describing their product or the thing that they'd invented. And obviously some of those people were not necessarily very good communicators in their own right.
No.
But you must have had the ability to not only make them feel at ease, but also to get their story about their product, the way they developed it from them.
Well,
would you say that's...
I think that's very true, and it's again something you learn out of broadcasting, because you are aware of the fact that you're sitting there in somebody's living room. And I discovered, to my pain, later on, that every now and again you'd meet somebody who said, I've seen you on the telly, I think you're bloody awful. You know, that's it. Or I could do your job better than you can do it yourself. I mean, really, you know. Or they'd say, geez, you're fat. You know, I mean, you get all sorts of comments like that. And the worst one, I suppose, was I went down to GTV9 Melbourne on one occasion, and the commissioner said to me, God blimey, Jeff Stone, I thought you were dead. You know. So what you begin to realise is that you are not anything special, and you've got a job to do, and your job is to try and make other people feel comfortable. That's your job. And it really should be our job at any time. If you're going out selling something, or if you're in the export business as you are, you've got to communicate one-to-one with a lot of people. And if they like you, it's easier for them to do business with you. And so I reckon that was part of my job, to do that, to make people feel comfortable, and also to make the viewers at home realise that this person was able to communicate, you know, that kind of thing. And yeah, a lot of them were quite nervous when we started, but as long as you can be quite natural with them and not become a star, that was one of the problems that you can run into. You can believe your own publicity. I think I've mentioned that already. But if you believe it, then you become a star, and if you become a star, other people have to look up to you. Well, you don't have to do that. I mean, that's not necessary, and it's not your job either. So, yeah, I found that was an easy thing to do. But again, it applies in life. Your business in exporting, for example, you're constantly dealing with people. And if you get on with the people you're dealing with, you have a much easier run than you will with the people that you kick or whatever it is, or demand things from. I find it's much easier there's an old thing I think Dale Carnegie said, you can get, was it more flies with honey than you can with, that's right.
That's one of his...
So I think that's very true, and I think it's something that we forget sometimes. Australians are wonderful people, because I'm an Australian. I'm a 41-year-old Australian, actually. And one of the things that I think other people don't understand about it, especially if they come from Asia, is that we have an attitude which says, well, when I first came to Australia, I'll give you an example. People would say to me, you're a bloody pommy bastard, why don't you go home? To which I would say, well, why don't you get your chains off? And that was actually the right way to handle the situation, because they didn't really mean it any more than I meant it either. But if you come from a country in which you're told that you're a wog or whatever it is, and you get upset about it, they're forgetting that they're in a country called Australia, and we're like that.
Yeah.
You see, so you need to get to know people and cultures and so on, which of course you'd have to. You'd have to, wouldn't you, in exporting and so on. And so you have to be aware of the different cultures. And in my world, I'll get often people from Asia, Japan, to China to a lesser extent. It's rude to speak loudly. You see, and so they're very quiet and they talk very quietly. But if you're making a speech to somebody, there's no way it's going to work, because you need to be able to use your voice. And I know that it's a cultural thing with them, so I have to try and help them to change from their culture to the Australian culture, or the American or the British, whatever it happens to be.
Sure.
So we do have these cultural things we have to overcome as well. And that would be true, wouldn't it? Surely in exporting and so on and so forth.
Well, that's right. And it's not just the culture of sociability, so to speak. It's also different business cultures, different ways of doing things. There's been a lot of talk in the world about Australian Wheat Board being involved in things, and I'm not going to make a comment on rights or wrongs, but in many parts of the world, they're the sorts of things that often have to be done to accomplish anything. Yeah. And we might think, in one view, that might be morally or ethically not the way to do it, but in those cultures, it's not necessarily the wrong thing. It's just the way life is.
It certainly is.
And so you've got to come to grips with that if you want to deal in those
Yes, you do.
places.
And you have to learn it, by the way, don't you? Yes. I spent many a happy day at Japanese conference tables. So I used to do a lot of work for both Mitsubishi and Nissan, and especially Mitsubishi, because they bought Chrysler out in Australia, and I was asked to go over to Tokyo and the rest of Japan, for that matter, to make a documentary about this company called Mitsubishi, which is an enormous company.
Yeah.
And
because cars is only one of the...
a small part of what they do. And I found that there was a protocol, a way of doing business. When you're talking to the board of directors of a company in Japan, it's not like talking to the board of directors in Australia. It's very formal, and you have to make sure your business card is right. One of the first things they do is feel it, because if it's not embossed, you're not worth much. Right. The other thing you have to make sure is that you've got your name and your company and so on in English on the one side, and on the other side it's in Japanese. And it better be embossed too, because otherwise, again, so you've got things like that, and you never do business straight away. There's always that introductory part. And also the other thing is you'll find that you've got to get consensus before you can get business done. If you can't get consensus, you ain't going to get business done, that kind of thing. But one of the things I found over the years that I managed to do was to put together a series of thoughts about successful people. And I kept it down to a fairly short list. But on the other hand, I believe that anybody would at least appreciate it. If you read, for example, Stephen Covey's, what is it, the Seven Habits of Successful
successful people.
Well, there's part of that in it. Yeah. But first of all, you've got to have a goal. You've got to have something to work to. And it's no good having something to work to unless you really, really want to do it. Now, going back to me in television, I didn't even know I wanted to be in television until I was lucky enough to get the experience. Now, a lot of us don't get that, do we? And so a lot of us end up like square pegs in round holes. But I do think it's important to have a good old think about what do you like doing with your life? What are the things that you enjoy doing? And if you can somehow relate those back to the job you're doing, then I think you're well on the way. But you've got to have goals, because otherwise you'll go drifting around. It's like sailing a yacht with nowhere to go, just going around in circles. So I think that's important. And all the successful business people I've known, all of them had goals. I mean, Churchill was going to win the war. Bannister was going to do the mile in less than 4 minutes. Dick Smith was another one. He had his bad times and
set some amazing goals too.
Didn't he set some amazing goals? And he achieved them. And I remember talking to him once, because not only was he Dick Smith, but he was Dick Smith the explorer and Dick Smith the pilot and all the rest of it. and Dick Smith the balloonist and all those things. And he had a system. He decided he wanted to do something like fly around the world in his helicopter or cross Australia in a balloon, which hadn't then been done. And he did it. He did all his things the same way. Having decided on the goal, he then decided, I need some expert input because I'm not sure that I have all the information I need to do it. So he'd get the right advice and he'd then work on it. Then he'd practice it. Going around the world, he didn't make it the first time. And he had another go at it. And I remember on one occasion saying to him, he was flying across the Atlantic in a single-engined helicopter. The weather was lousy and he was down to about 30, 40 feet above the waves. And he suddenly realised that if he was going to crash, if anything happened to the engine, he wouldn't even have time to get his life jacket on or his life raft out before he hit the deck. And he wouldn't have survived more than 30 seconds in the cold water before he sort of started going woozy and unconscious. And he said, for a moment there, I really was quite frightened. I said, but it didn't stop you, did it? And he said, oh, no. No, he said, once I managed it, I knew it could be done. And so I did, I was prepared to have another go. But see, that people can be like that. They've set goals, they're determined that they're going to achieve them, and they do. But you have to have them in life. That's absolutely necessary.
So with Dick Smith, he obviously started off, I think it was in Neutral Bay.
Yes, I'm not quite sure where, but he had a little workshop in a bunch of other workshops. And he was selling, in those days, it was before it became proper Dick Smith, and he was selling bits and pieces of electronic equipment, which was in its infancy, really. And he suddenly found that somebody owed him about 20,000 quid, and he couldn't pay his own bills, which were roughly 20,000 bucks worth. And he thought, I'm in real strife. But Dick's the sort of person who was very ethical, and he wanted to pay the bills, even though the other fellow wouldn't give him his 20,000. So again, he did something that a lot of us don't do. He went across the road to a bloke who was in mail order. He marched in and he said, my name's Dick Smith, I've got a place across the road, and if I'm going to go broke unless you can teach me how to become a mail order person, we don't clash. And the guy said, come on in. And taught Dick he gave him all the forms, how to cope, all that. I mean, just like you do, with all your work. And to cut a long story short, it saved his life.
Right.
Mail order was the next step he took. And then after that, it's history. And
so did they joint venture at all, or it was just a matter of mentoring?
No, it was just, yes.
Mentoring and coaching?
Yes, just mentoring. That's all it was.
It was just a matter of asking.
Yeah, that's right. But it's amazing how often we don't. We feel very often, well, if I've got to ask, obviously I'm lacking something.
Yeah.
Well, we all lack something.
Oh, that's right.
And one of the things, again, broadcasting teaches you that you can't know all the answers. And I think the people who interview say, oh, yes, of course, I understand the dihydrospran sprocket. Oh, yes, of course I do, yes. I think they're idiots because the audience doesn't understand it. And if you don't, the audience won't. So I think you have to say to them, well, I'm sorry, but I don't really know what a dihydrosplan sprocket is. And then you've got to get them to come down and talk your language. So it's very necessary that you do that kind of thing. So that's something else that I think is important. I think it's also important that you build your own self-esteem, because I don't know anybody yet, and I've met an awful lot of people who are either public speakers, politicians, CEOs of big companies, film stars. I haven't met one individual yet who felt that they were totally confident in everything they did. I haven't met one. We're all like it, and yet everybody else will say, but you're special because you've had the experience and you can do it. Sure, but that didn't mean to say I started that way. Everybody starts that way. Winston Churchill, for example, made his first speech in the House of Commons. He was going to do it extemporarily, without notes.
Yes.
And he forgot what he was going to talk about in the middle. Oh boy, we all done that. And he had to sit down. And from that day onwards, that man never made a speech without writing it first.
Okay.
And he wrote it. He didn't get other people to write it, he wrote his speeches. But there are so many others. I've met some of the most glamorous women in the world. Miss Worlds, Miss Australias and film stars and so on. I've met one yet who thinks her body's good. I mean, I've looked at them all and thought they're fantastic, but they don't think so. They've got big bottoms or something. We won't bother about the rest of their anatomy, but but there's always something wrong. And I just don't understand that, because I really do believe that although there are things we're not good at, there are lots of other things we are good at. And you can learn the rest anyway. You really can. Most of these things you can learn.
So would you say self-esteem is a balance between not being too puffed up and not a low view of yourself? I often get my lot to write down 2 columns. One column is what are you good at? The other column is what do you think you're bad at? Where are your weaknesses and so on? And the what are you good at and how are you a nice person column is fairly short. When it comes to what are you bad at, it's a long column. And you say to them afterwards, come on, you may be a very kind person. That's a gift. Oh, well, I didn't count that. Or you're a generous person, or you're a loving person. I mean, these things are all important. Yes.
But on the other hand, a lot of these guys don't think that way. In fact, Stephen Covey raises that very issue when he says, when we're living life and working these days, we have actually 4 quadrants that we live in. Yeah. And from memory, I think the first top left-hand quadrant is, I'm always dealing with the urgent. The next one on the right is the important one. Then I think the third one is the trivia. And the fourth one is going to enjoying yourself and doing all that. And he'll ask his people, well, where do they fit? And everybody says, well, I always work in the urgent department. Yeah, because somebody else is saying, I need that 5 minutes ago. I mean, television's like that. So you forget that the important bit is what are you going to do with your life? That's the important bit. Exactly. And we don't have time to think about that, do we? Because we're always chasing the urgent, so we just don't get time to sit down and have a think. And we should. They say you should not be running your business. You should be, hang on, I've got that the wrong way around. What I'm trying to say is most people work in their business. You should be working on your business.
Yeah, Michael Gerber says that in The E-Myth. He visited his other E-Myth books. Yeah,
because otherwise you're going to get wrapped up in the urgent and you can't sit back and take the broad picture. Another mate of mine, bless his heart, he's gone to God now, but he was Bruce Gyngell, and the first man to speak words on Australian television. Bruce ended up as a very senior executive both in Australia, UK, America and so on. And I often used to say to him, in fact the first thing I said to him once was, how do you feel when you fail? And he looked at me and he laughed and he said, do you know, I was 42 years old before I ever realised I'd failed. And I said, you've got to be kidding. He said, no, seriously. He said, my grandparents and my mother brought me up. He said, I even failed a year at school. And instead of getting kicked in the backside as I would have done by my father, his parents or his grandparents said, Bruce, aren't you lucky? You've got another opportunity of spending another year getting even more out of that year than you got out of it this year. Geez, you're lucky. Yeah. And of course, with that kind of upbringing, he didn't know what a mistake was until he went to Harvard. And the professor at Harvard said, I want you all to think of the most heinous failure that you've ever been responsible for. And Bruce sat there thinking, I don't think I've ever made one. That was the first time he became aware of being a failure. From then on, of course, he realised he was human like the rest of us. But he had a philosophy about it, and his philosophy was, first of all, if you don't make mistakes, you never learn.
Correct.
Now, the only people I reckon who do not get included in that are airline pilots and ship's captains, and train drivers and people like that. But for the rest of us, we're allowed to make mistakes, and you learn more from those than you ever do from your successes.
It's a pity as adults we don't think that way, because as children, it's expected you're going to learn from your mistakes.
That's right. Yes.
But often in business,
that's right.
The allowance of mistakes is often viewed poorly.
That's true.
But the benefit is that as long as you learn from that mistake and you catapult yourself
That's
onwards,
exactly right.
That's a good thing.
It is a good thing. And in actual fact, Bruce, from that moment onwards, Bruce's attitude towards problems changed dramatically. And I used to say to him, well, all right, okay, you get a serious problem, you've got to do something about it straight away, or Kerry will kick you in the backside.
Yeah. And talking Kerry Packer.
Yeah, Kerry Packer. And so he said, well, the very first thing I do is go for a walk in the park across the road. And I look at the trees and the birds and I listen to the sounds they're making and so on. He said, and I clear my mind. He said, then I come back to the office and I sit down and I have another look at what seems to be the problem. He said, and then I start thinking solutions. I stop thinking problems, I start thinking solutions. And often people will say to me, well, how the hell do you do that? Well, it's not that difficult. What you try and do is there an opportunity buried away in this problem somewhere? Is there something I can learn from this problem? Is there something I don't know about this problem and I need some help with? In other words, you would start by taking a more positive view of the problem. And you may well find that there is something in it anyway. And if there isn't, you go find somebody who's been down that road before. And you'll find that most of these problems are solvable. In fact, I think they pretty much all are. Even if you're about to die, there's not much you can do about it at that stage. If you're not ready to go, well, you should have done that work a long time ago.
So that's an interesting point that you raised, and Bruce mentioned it, of basically taking time out. And
yes.
We see it in comes to mind basketball matches
yes.
in particular.
Yes.
But and football games.
Yeah.
The coach will see a problem,
yes.
take time out
yes.
to hopefully change the mindset
of
the players.
That's right.
And I can remember my colleague John Yellen and I were in business negotiations, and it was coming to a sticking point, and it came to a point where almost at loggerheads with the people on the other side of the table. And I just said, time out, because John was doing a lot of the talking and I was sort of observing how the ebb and flow of the talk was going. I said, time out. We actually walked almost around the block in this Melbourne suburb where the negotiations were going on 7 times before we came back in, but we changed our dimension of what we were trying to achieve. We had to get the big picture of what we were trying to achieve. And when we looked at it, the sticking points weren't big things really, and we just had to change the mindset. But when we came in afresh, things changed, the dynamics of the meeting changed, and we achieved what we were set out to achieve.
Yes. See, that was a mental thing that you done.
And that was a team effort as well.
Yes, it was. Yeah. And in fact, that reminds me of something else about our brains, because so often we say, I can't do this. And it comes back to sports people. And we've learned a great deal about sports psychology over the last few years. And one of the early ones I can remember was the Illinois basketball team. Don't ask me why I know about the Illinois basketball team. It was because I was listening to a man called Lou Tice. I don't know what he's doing these days, but he was not only a sports coach, but he was also a motivational speaker. And he said he was brought in to see if he could do something to increase the motivation of these guys. So he thought, well, first of all, let's find out where they are. So he broke the team into 3 groups. He said, group number 1, you come in every day, and every day you will practice. He said, getting the ball in the net and doing all that. Group number 2, you will come in every day and you will sit down in the big gymnasium. He said, and you won't lift a finger, but mentally you are going to be playing basketball in your mind. And he said, group number 3, you can come in and do what you like. Just enjoy yourselves for a couple of weeks. And the astonishing thing was that when he got them all back together again, the first group had done quite well and improved on their previous performance. And believe it or not, the second group, who had not put their finger on a ball, had almost done as well, and the third group had gone downwards. And Lou also said he was once coaching a group of little kids, little girls, and one little girl, every time she tried to get the ball in the basket, it missed. And she was very downhearted. And Lou it was just one question he asked her. He said, if you did know how to do it, how would you do it? And of course if you did know how to do it, how would you do it? And so she said, because she'd been taught, she said, I'd hold the ball like this, and then I'd do that, and it went straight in the net. Do you know, 13 out of 15 times she got it in the net after that. In other words, up here, in the mind. That's what it was all about. And we don't use our minds half the way we ought to. So those things are tremendously important. If you don't think you can do something, you can't. And if you do think you can do something, you'll stand a pretty good chance of pulling it off.
Well, that's what Carnegie and also Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich.
Yes.
It's
classic.
It's
that,
think and grow rich.
That book.
It's not work and grow rich.
No,
it's
think and grow rich. That book, Think and Grow Rich, I think he probably wrote it late 1920s, early 1930s.
1936
was it 36?
Yeah.
Well, I was on a plane not so long ago, and the bloke sitting next to me was reading Think and Grow Rich. And I had to look at it, and I said, that is one of the best books going. And he said to me, I always take it with me. He was a businessman, you know. And I said, and you still read it? Oh, he said, again and again. And that's something else about it. I mean, you've always got to prop yourself up. You've always got to, you know, keep it at the forefront of your mind about all the good things in that book. And it's still being published.
It is, and my copy, I've got sticky tape.
Yes.
The pages are falling out. I've got it marked and highlighted and penciled.
It's a brilliant book.
And I actually probably should get a new one, but I value the old one because of all the markings, and I can identify when I've gone through it. And each time I go through it, there's new gems in there.
Yes, there are.
They weren't there last time.
No, I know. You're absolutely right about that. I find exactly the same thing myself. But it raises other issues, that all the blocks in our lives, because that's really what we've been talking about, haven't we? Other blocks, for example, are going to be down the business of frustration. If you're in business, you're going to get frustrated. Sooner or later, you're going to be frustrated. And I can't remember who said it. It might have been Anthony Robbins on one occasion, but he said something to the effect that if you can deal with frustration, you can deal with anything. And that does take some doing, because if going through life and it's all lovely and easy, doesn't happen. Well, if it does, it's a miracle. That's right. But I haven't met anybody yet who's gone through life with life being easy. Even the very famous people, well, especially the very famous people, they're always in the newspaper because they're getting divorced again. And I can remember the Queen had one year that she called Annus Horribilis or something like that. Why couldn't she say just a terrible year? I don't know, but she doesn't speak like that. But I mean, they all have it, and it's the way you deal with frustration that's important. And you've just got to expect that it's there. And the people who succeed are the ones who are prepared to get down there and find a way through it and out the other side. You may have to change direction a bit sometimes, but you don't lose sight of the end goal. And I think that's important too. So, you know, there's so many things that I've run an 8-week course on this. I think I've just done it, actually.
This is the end of part 1. Please proceed now to part 2.